everybody, and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast. This is Redcoats of the Caribbean, and I've been agitating behind the scenes for some time now for more Caribbean content. Although, in fairness, it's not like anyone disagrees with me because not only is there so much fascinating history in this area of the world in this period, but it's also a really important theatre of the revolutionary and Napoleonic period in its own right, even if it has been traditionally quite neglected by historians. But all of that is to say that this kind of content is something we hope to do more of. Today, it's kind of a bird's eye view of the British Caribbean across the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period. And we're going to try and really get a measure of British actions and interests in the region and to draw some connections to the more traditional history. And to that effect, joining us today is David Lambert, Professor of Caribbean History at the University of Warwick. He's an all-round authority on Caribbean history with special expertise in this period, and he has just published his much anticipated book on the West India regiments, which were regiments of black soldiers who fought in the Napoleonic Wars for the British and other conflicts. And the book is entirely related to the conversation we're about to have. So if you are interested in Caribbean Napoleonic history, do check out Soldiers of Uncertain Rank, the West India Regiments in British Imperial Culture by David Lambert, published by Cambridge University Press. And it is hot off the press. It was only released a month or so ago. David, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Josh. Very nice to be here.
Good to hear. And also joining me here today is a man who I know already has his copy of David's book, Dr. Zach White.
Hello,
Zach,
mate. Yes, we were talking about this before we came on air. In fact, this is probably going to be my Christmas reading, which tells you a great deal about just how nerdy a Napoleonic Christmas I have in store. But yes, I haven't had the chance to flick through it yet, other than as, in a sort of passing way. But this was in my pre-order list on Amazon.
Wonderful.
So indeed, so for whatever that counts for. So yeah, this is a book that I'm greatly looking forward to reading, and I suspect we will do a dedicated interview on it in due course.
That'll be great.
I think the West Indian regiments definitely deserve one. And this is, as I say, a much anticipated piece of scholarship that people have been excited about for quite some time. So people should get their hands on it. So, kind of, well, I sound like Liam here with a scene setting question, but geographically, then people might not be as familiar with like the geopolitics of the Caribbean as at the start of this period as they might be with Europe. So, what did Britain own in 1792, and what did it stand to gain or lose when war was declared with France?
Okay, so the Caribbean by the late 18th century is this thoroughly colonized part of the world and has been since the late 15th century, where Christopher Columbus, Europeans first arrived in the region. By the late 18th century, the colonies, the territories of the region are divided up between the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and others. And Britain has its the most important British colony in the Caribbean at this time is Jamaica. It's the largest territorial of the British colonies. It's also the most economically important in terms of production of plantation products. And then Britain also controls a sweep of islands in the Eastern Caribbean from kind of Antigua and Montserrat, and then down the chain towards kind of Grenada at the bottom. And then you've got Barbados off to the east. Barbados is one of had been England's oldest colonies and is often the kind of disembarkation point for British expeditions in the region. And interlaced amongst these islands are a series of French colonies: Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint Lucie, Tobago off further to the south. And then there are also some very large and as yet relatively uneconomically developed Spanish islands, Cuba and Puerto Rico. But the kind of heart of the whole system, the most important, most valuable of all these colonies is Saint-Domingue, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. And that surpasses even Jamaica in terms of its economic importance in the region. And this is a valuable prize to be taken by the British. And basically, what the British are trying to do in this period is, on the one hand, shore up their own islands, defend them against French attack, and at the second point, trying to potentially seize take these French colonies away from their enemy, to damage French commercial interests, to damage French naval power. And this is something that had been done previously. In Britain and France have, of course, fought a series of wars in the 18th century: the 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, And the French Revolutionary War is just the latest of a series of engagements in which the Caribbean is this very, very important theatre of conflict.
Surprise, surprise, we're going to rabbit hole straight off the bat.
Mm.
My first question, I guess, is in terms of the balance of power, particularly talking about how Saint-Domingue is widely regarded as sort of the most economically developed, the most significant of the Caribbean islands. Contrast that with, for example, Jamaica, Barbados, etc. Where does that balance of power lie in the Caribbean? Who sort of, at least in theory, holds the upper hand, and how is that having an effect on thinking back in London?
So I'd say by the end of the 18th century, the balance is certainly overall in Britain's favour. In the course of the 18th century, Britain has captured a series of French territories. So former French islands like St. Vincent, Grenada, Dominica had all been captured and then held onto in the course of the 7 Years' War. And these islands were relatively economically underdeveloped under the French, but see a kind of impouring of investment and enslaved labor into these kind of ceded islands. So the British plantation economy is expanding in the second half of the 18th century, and it's very vibrant. But Saint-Domingue represents like 2/5 of all French overseas trade. It's by far the most populous of the plantation colonies. It's got 500,000 people living in it, of whom almost 90% are enslaved Africans. So that's the kind of, and as I say, by the end of the 18th century, Saint-Domingue has surpassed Jamaica in importance. So in some ways, I think it'd be fair to say that Saint-Domingue is far more important to the French than, say, Jamaica is to the British, because Britain has other colonies that are also important. But what Saint-Domingue's growth is showing, and indeed the kind of relatively effective performance of the French Navy in the American Revolutionary War, is that France is on a trajectory. It's sort of not necessarily going to surpass Britain, but there's much more vibrancy in the French colonial economy than perhaps it would have seemed there had been over previous decades. And Saint-Domingue is, I say, it's the most intense, it's the most profitable plantation colony, and has far surpassed anything that the British control at this point. Later on, a much larger island like Cuba will become even more important, and that's in a sense the aftermath of the story of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, but that's yet to come. But at this point, I'd say France is on the rise. Is definitely the way to think about it.
You've set me up beautifully there for where I was going to go next, which is sort of this discussion point that keeps cropping up when it comes to British strategy in the Caribbean. Jeremy Black makes the point, Charles Esdale has reiterated this point on the Napoleonic Quarterly in the early episodes that look particularly at the conflict in the Caribbean, about how British strategy is about, during this period, when Britain thinks in terms of a more global strategy, the first move is to go and grab some sugar islands and then use them as a bargaining chip, trade them for concessions or gains or whatever it might be. And Charles also makes the point that there's an economic benefit to going and taking control of these islands, because then you deprive France of that income from these islands. Now, from what you've said there's a slight tension between that argument and some of the history, in the sense that sometimes when Britain goes and grabs these islands, it keeps hold of them. And therefore, the argument that, the British campaigns in the West Indies aren't about imperial acquisition, but rather about diplomatic negotiation, kind of comes up into, I don't want to overstate the conflict between the two, but there is a tension there. I'm just curious what your take is on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, because there are certain French colonies that at certain points Britain does occupy, but that always at the end of whichever particular piece we're talking about get handed back to the French. Martinique, Guadeloupe would be the two most obvious examples there. But Britain occupies Martinique for a long period of time, returns it to France at the Treaty of Amiens, and then takes it again, and then returns it to France again. So there are some colonies that are seen partly because there is a large established French population that would probably be not very happy with extended British occupation. Partly also because, in a sense, the potential for investment is less in those more developed more mature plantation colonies like Guadeloupe and Martinique. Whereas the less developed islands, like Grenada, for example, there's a lot of opportunity for new investment, for new profit. So I think there's two things going on there. There is the kind of bargaining chip argument, seize it and then chip it in for something else. But there's definitely also expansionism going on, and that expansion is especially going on mainly in the kind of southern parts of the Caribbean. It starts with the ceded islands. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, Grenada sees this huge inward investment, Scottish settlers moving there. Grenada actually, by the time of the French Revolution, has surpassed Barbados as Britain's second most valuable colony because there's so much virgin land that can be developed, expansion of the plantation system. It's very easy. Whereas in a place like Barbados, they've been planting sugarcane for centuries, the soil is exhausted. It's harder and harder to kind of maintain profit levels. And that kind of southern expansion then continues. One of the colonies that the British hold on to with in the Treaty of Amiens is Spanish Trinidad. That's the only Caribbean territory they hold on to, and Trinidad will undertake a kind of huge sugar boom in the early 19th century. And there are also later on a series of Dutch colonies that the British will hold on to. So there is a kind of another story here, which is about the expansion of what we might think of as kind of the plantation frontier, and the new opportunities that are out there. So I think there's two stories which we need to kind of understand at the same time: expansionism in certain parts of the Caribbean, and then this more traditional geopolitical kind of bargain making in the older French colonies. Sandeman's a little bit different. The British hope they can take it, but at a certain point, what they're really hoping for is to deny it to the French. The idea of at least if Sandeman could become a neutral island or neutral colony, rather, which of course in the end it does, becomes independent. That is about definitely trying to hurt France, and ultimately, of course, the failure of the Napoleonic project to re-establish control in Sandeman is one thing that leads to the unraveling of the French imperial ambitions in the Western Hemisphere as a whole, the Louisiana Purchase. Which is so that in some ways Sandeman is so important. There's a slightly different story again.
And is that difference in focus? Sorry, Josh, I know you can't get a word in edgeways, but plus ça change on this podcast, right? In terms of that difference in approach when it comes to the thinking with regards to Sandeman, is that driven by a sort of realpolitik assessment of what it would take to try and hold Sandeman, thinking about the scale of the island, thinking about the challenges of trying to effectively achieve some kind of cultural almost assimilation from one nationality to another? Is that what's at the core of the thinking, or is there another reason behind it?
I think it's absolutely true to say Sandeman is so much. I mean, it's territorially large, but it's also so populous. This is not Martinique. This is a kind of a major colony with a huge population. I mean, the British do hope when they invade Sandeman, and the Spanish invade Sandeman as well in 1793. Both of them, I think, have ambitions that at least they can maybe establish a foothold, or in the Spanish case, perhaps take over parts of Sandeman and from the neighboring colony of Santo Domingo. But it becomes apparent fairly quickly, I think, in the course of the mid-1790s, that this is just far too. They're trying to bite off far too much that they can chew, and they're facing. This is one of the interesting things from about 1794 across all of the Caribbean. The British aren't just fighting sort of French military forces for control of these colonies. They're fighting populations. They're fighting, they're fighting tens of hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom want freedom. So, in some ways, the war moves in Sandeman, especially, moves into a different phase. The British decide it's better to cut their losses and, in a sense, do something different with Sandeman, which is move into something that's a bit more like Britain will do in South America with the breakup of the Spanish Empire. we think about an informal empire, and maybe they can open up trade with Sandaman, or an increasingly independent Sandaman, which is one of the reasons why they are prepared to kind of cut separate deals with this gentleman here, with Toussaint Louverture, in the hope that either, maybe it'll move towards some kind of independent state, which will A, hurt the French, but B, also open up kind of commercial opportunities. But I think you're right. There's just something about the scale and complexity of the conflicts in Sandaman, and of the society in Sandaman. It's just too big a thing to swallow, basically.
Sandermank having that scale and complexity, it really deserves a podcast of its own, let alone an episode. And we're not going to try and do justice to the entire Haitian Revolution here today, but just provide an angle on it, I guess. But having said that, um, as you've highlighted, there's lots of islands to think about, and I think it makes sense to perhaps put Sandermang to one side for a moment and
Yeah.
think about when war does erupt, how it unfolds in the Lesser Antilles and in the other islands you mentioned. So the first phase of war begins in 1794 with the Grey Jervis expedition, as it's called. So I guess simple question, who are Grey and Jervis, and how does the expedition they give their name to get on?
So even before we get to that expedition, it is worth saying, I mean, Britain already, and France, of course, already have military forces in the region. That's another story here, that the Caribbean has become an increasingly militarized region in the second half of the 18th century. And British commanding officers are given the instructions to, like, do what you can with your local forces initially. So, for example, Tobago is seized. And we see when British forces arrive in Tobago, can take it over in 1793. There are, although it's a French island, it had previously been a British island, and indeed a French island before that. And the British troops are welcomed by some of the planters. And indeed, that story about kind of planters welcoming the British arriving, because the British are there to guarantee the system of racial slavery and the plantation economy, is something you see elsewhere. Gray and Jervis are basically given this what I think a pretty large expeditionary force, and their instructions are to essentially try to reduce, well, two things. One is to capture, potentially, take over Martinique, take over Saint Lucie, take over Guadeloupe, but also to ensure, to bulk up British forces elsewhere in the Caribbean, to stop the French from doing exactly the same to them. And there's pretty successful expedition. Jervis and Gray work very effectively together, and this is that kind of cooperation between the Navy and the Army is one of the kind of features of this particular expedition. And very quickly, in the course of 1794, they capture Martinique, they capture Guadeloupe, and they do capture Saint Lucie. And so things go pretty well. Essentially, the expedition has been a success, and the British have achieved everything they wanted to achieve very, very rapidly. And they do so through, as I say, through combined use of naval and army forces. Gray is famous for the use of kind of, this of kind of use of being a very aggressive strategist and tactician. The sort of combat that's taking place in the Caribbean they're not like set battles. It's usually quick force marches, lots of people being, lots of bayonet charges and things like that. It's a very close and bloody, but relatively swift series of campaigns that have fought. And as I say, it looks like the British have been very successful. By about mid-1794. They've achieved all their goals. Happy days. But unfortunately for them, things don't. The situation changes very rapidly after that.
Before we dive into that, I just want to sort of talk about the practicalities of trying to take these islands, which inevitably sort of asks all sorts of questions about the terrain that's involved. I think people sort of have two perceptions of Caribbean islands. They're either sort of luscious sandy places that are all very sort of low lying and flat, or they are fundamentally volcanic islands. But in amongst all of that, we also have this perception that, there are regions of sort of very lush vegetation, very thick forest, contrasted with inevitably those open or more open spaces of cultivated land where slaves are being used to grow sugar or tobacco, whatever it might be. And then sort of sandy beaches. And my understanding of this is not detailed, I will readily admit. But from what I understand, essentially one of the core elements of British strategy has to become that question of, can you stop the French from withdrawing to a stronghold somewhere deep within the island? Could I ask you to just sort of talk through what that British strategy is and the challenges that come with enacting that? Because it implies that there's a sort of unorthodoxy in the way in which the British are approaching trying to take these islands that has come through experience.
Yeah. So those two kind of extremes of the landscape that you described, Zach, are precisely there in different islands. So the kind of flat, that's Barbados, and to some extent Antigua. And it's no um, coincidence that they're also the islands that have seen the most expansive plantation. The plantation economy is its most extensive because it's the easiest to clear land and to. That's what you want. You want flat land, perfect for planting. It is worth saying that when you do have sugar estates, and these are primarily sugar estates, these aren't. This is not flat land. This is like, sugar canes are very, very tall grass. So actually, some of the accounts you read of kind of skirmishes and fights that are going on around plantations, there's a lot of cover, if you want to describe it that way. These aren't kind of like, this is not pastoral land. So, even when the land is cleared and cultivated, it's also still, there's a lot of cover, I suppose. And then, yeah, you've got some of the volcanic islands where you might have, like St. Lucia or St. Vincent, where you've got areas which are rugged, difficult terrain, because there hasn't been plantation expansion in some of those areas. Therefore, you also have kind of heavy, dense bush and tree cover. Generally, you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of the kind of fastnesses, the forts, they're not in interiors. They're not like in the middle of these islands because they need to be supplied, but they're often high up overlooking major ports, these kind of fortifications. And most of the time, what the British are trying to do is to rapidly overwhelm the French by applying a lot of massive amount of force at a particular point, often making attacking from multiple directions, multiple landings at different points, and quickly trying to, as rapidly as possible, overwhelm the defenders. Often these conflicts end in a kind of often usually quite a brief siege of the final fort. Until the flag is lowered and the British take over. So in most places, the French don't hold out for very long when they're massively overwhelmed. It depends on the terms that they're being offered and so forth. Prisoners of war being shipped home and stuff like that. But then, even after, in a sense, maybe the tricolor has been lowered and the British are in control of the major fort, often the conflict will then continue in other ways because, as I said, the conflict, particularly after 1794 across much of the Caribbean, isn't just a conflict between British and French regulars, soldiers and sailors. It's about populations. So you'll see formerly enslaved people, you'll see kind of intermediary group, the so-called free people of color, the gens de couleur libre, these sorts of people who come to form the backbone of the French Republican Army and a military effort in the Caribbean. They will flee precisely to those harder to reach areas and then continue warfare against the British. And there's an absolutely brilliant account of this by Brigadier General John Moore, who would later die at Corunna in 1809. And his diary account of the just over a year when he's basically left in charge of, he's appointed military governor of St. Lucia, Saint Lucie, and basically just left the job of mopping up after all the formal surrender. And he's just constantly marching around trying to, almost like whack-a-mole, trying to fight these people who are constantly running away from him, desperately trying to coordinate with the Royal Navy to, get them to stop supplies being smuggled in of arms and ammunition to maintain the insurgency, basically. And increasingly being forced to use sort of like scorched earth tactics, burning the provision grounds of his enemies to try and force them into, starve them into submission. It is a really it's a really eye-opening account of this kind of conflict. And one interesting things about it is, I mean, now, when we think about what Moore was doing, or what was often happening in these places, we'd call it something like maybe counterinsurgency, or we might call it guerrilla warfare. And of course, they don't have that way of thinking about what they're doing is not something they have available. And one of the new projects I'm working on at the moment is to try and think about how they're trying to understand the nature of the conflict they're fighting. Um, they refer to their enemies, they call them brigands, they call them banditti. And that's partly about, in a sense, delegitimizing them because many of the people they're fighting are of African descent. But it's also about they don't have a language to describe the kind of hit and run tactics they face. And one of the interesting things is that many of the people who are involved in some of this, the kind of more senior officers in the Caribbean in the 1790s, some of them had served in the American Revolutionary War and have kind of brought some of that kind of way of thinking about wars against populations, that kind of insurgency, and they're trying to sort of make some of those models fit what they're doing here, fighting in this harsh, rugged terrain against enemies who, of course, are motivated in most cases by the desire to remain free. It's a pretty powerful motivation, and far, far more probably more powerful thing that's motivating the British soldiers, frankly. So yeah, that just gives the war is the nature of the warfare is so different. So even though amphibious assaults and army naval cooperation might be familiar, what then happens once you've nominally taken over these places is very different.
Well, this interview's gone in an entirely different direction to the one I anticipated. I won't lie, but is fascinating. I mean, the original set of questions was fascinating, but this is fascinating in entirely different ways. When you said French, when you talked about banditti there, and obviously when we talk about guerrilla tactics, particularly within a Napoleonic context, we instantly go to the guerrilla, the guerrilla war of the Spanish War of Independence, the Peninsular War, as we refer to it in British terminology. And when you said the word French banditti, my immediate thought was that caricature that's produced in 1808 when the news is breaking about the war in Spain. And I should know if it's a Gilray or a Cruikshank. I think it's a Gilray. He entitles it Spanish Patriots Attacking the French Banditti, again, kind of tapping into that delegitimizing element. So I would like to know more about that project in due course. That maybe sort of interview, whatever will be on by that point, 3 of this series seems to be starting up. Josh looks on in appalled horror at the number of mini-series that I'm creating on this podcast.
Not at all, not at all. I've just checked. It is Gilray.
It is, thank you. So there is something still rattling around in the grey matter. That's good to know. What I did want to tap into there, though, was the culture that must exist in the Caribbean islands for you to have this willingness to engage in an insurgency style operation against the attacker. And that sort of suggests perhaps elements of patriotism. Now, that's a very, very dodgy word to use because patriotism, nationalism, these aren't really ideas that exist within a late 18th century context. But there is something, perhaps, and this is kind of my question, in there about loyalty to the metropole, to the home nation amongst colonial societies. Equally, there are other potential contributing factors in that. Are there concerns about you talk about how quite often I believe you said it was sort of the mixed race sort of facet of society that quite often is the group of individuals who are involved in these insurgency operations. And I wonder if there are sort of concerns there about, well, the British are going to come in and they're going to upset the status quo of society and take rights or start giving rights. And I wonder if there's any of that in there. So that's a long-winded way of saying, here's a broad question. What's culture like in these societies at this time? And obviously very different depending on different sort of facets of society. But can we at least start to unpick that?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about, okay, let's just take a quick step back. I think one of the things that's interesting, you both know as very well, that one of the interesting things about the revolution in the Napoleonic Wars is, you're right that kind of ideas about nationhood and patriotism are information, but they become the kind of the ideological nature of the conflict, especially in the French Revolutionary War. The important, the motivating importance of ideas as a motivation of, you know, the success of the levy en masse and the kind of the mobilizing whole populations to achieve things that seemed quite remarkable. You know, there is something about this moment. You know, don't want to get into the argument about whether this is a kind of example of total war or whatever, but you know, there is something about motivation and morale and ideas about service and duty and how they are expressed that are information in this period. Now, if you look at a typical Caribbean plantation society, you've basically got kind of three main groups. You've got a white free minority dominated by the largest landowners, the planters. These are the wealthiest ones. They dominate these islands politically, economically, socially, culturally. And then you have at the bottom of the society, think about it as a pyramid. The majority of the population are enslaved people of African descent. Men, women, and children, either born in Africa and forced across on slave ships, or the descendants of those people. And you've then got a third group, particularly in places like Jamaica and Sandaman, so the kind of larger, more mature plantation societies. You've got the emergence of this third group. The British tend to be called free people of color, you know, gens de couleur libre in French. These are of African or mixed European African ancestry, but they're free. And the kind of split, let's say, just take, you know, they're usually sort of maybe starting to get close towards the size of the free white population in some places, but there are sort of a third, you know, a much smaller group than, say, the enslaved population. Now, in the French Caribbean, the kind of core tenets of the French Revolution are very attractive to many of those different groups. If you are a gens de couleur, you're a free person of color who you might be actually quite wealthy. You might yourself be a plantation owner and an owner of enslaved people, perhaps because you inherited them from your white father, which is kind of typical of some of the elite within this group. You are nonetheless living under the shadow of a whole series of legal and social discriminations and limitations on what you can pass on in property to your children. In the French Caribbean, sometimes it's limitations on the form of title that you're allowed to use to describe yourself, monsieur or madame, what clothes you're allowed to wear, what name you're allowed to take. In that context, equality as a concept, as a kind of motivating characteristic of the new French Republic is a very attractive one. And some of this group become almost like the vanguard of the French Revolution in the Caribbean. They're the ones who are like, you know, they're the ones who are arguing in Paris, saying, you know, we are this exactly applies to us. You know, the new principles of the French Revolution exactly apply to us. We are the backbone of the militia in the French Caribbean. Many of us are. We fought in the American Revolutionary War. We are absolutely central to sort of French power in the Caribbean. We should be treated as full citizens. Our Frenchness, our patriotic loyalty that we've expressed in various ways, acknowledged. So that group is very, very motivated by what they see as essentially the promise of the French Revolution to end basically white supremacism, if you want to be a bit technical about it. And that idea is also very attractive to the often French-speaking, French culturally orientated groups like those people in the British colonies that used to be French colonies, places like Grenada, where a man like Julien Fedon is also motivated by exactly the same thing and leads an insurrection against the British in 1795. What then, the other, of course, elements of this is partly driven by what's happening in Saint-Domingue, but if we won't go into that in any detail. When Victor Hugo arrives in the Caribbean and arrives in Guadeloupe, which the British had captured as part of that Grey Jervis expedition, he brings with him news that the French have formally abolished slavery. And with that, and with the French state's acknowledgement of the equality of people irrespective of their race, which of course is so attractive to those gens de couleur, he's able to mobilize those large parts of that population in Guadeloupe against the British, which is why the British are forced out of Guadeloupe by the end of 1794. So the British aren't just fighting French Republican soldiers from France, they're now fighting enslaved people who've now been freed by the French, or at least had their own self-liberating efforts acknowledged by the French, if you prefer. And then this intermediary group who are now being treated as full citizens. And the forms of racial discrimination that they've been subjected to are being, at least in theory, cast to one side. The problem the British have from the end of 1794 onwards is that they are basically the defenders of the status quo. And the status quo in the Caribbean means racial slavery and white supremacism. And that's why certain white planters will welcome them into Martinique and support them and ally with them. But the majority of the population of those places are become deeply opposed. The British are seen as I say, they're the counter-revolutionary force in the region. They're the ones who are propping up not just the plantation system. They're not just there to raise, the Union flag, but they're the people who are going to guarantee a racially organized plantation system in which slavery is the central form of labor. And people who want their equality, people who want their freedom, take up arms against the British because they want to preserve the things that they'd won under the French, now under British occupation. And as I say, in places that had previously been French colonies but were now British colonies, you also see insurrections against in St. Vincent and in Grenada, and Jamaica's a little bit different, but something happens there as well. So that's the problem. And you can read that in some of the accounts that people like John Moore are writing. So Moore describes, even though he's like spending this time traveling around St. Lucia, describing in great detail the kind of the incredibly tiring and self-destructive from his perspective counterinsurgency effort he's going through, he can't help but write with a certain amount of admiration about his enemies. He kind of decries the violence extremes to which they go, but he kind of acknowledges that that they're motivated by some ideas of freedom. And as to very specifically, Zach, your question about kind of patriotism, there's a really interesting account he gives at a certain point where they've captured a suspected insurgent they've kind of it's not clear whether they've tortured him or whether they've simply kind of interrogated, tried to get him to confess, and he denies up to the point where they're about to shoot him that he's had anything to do. He's not been fighting the British. They've got it completely wrong. And just before they shoot him, he shouts "Viva la République" the moment they shoot him. And more, this kind of shakes him because this is who he's fighting. These people who are that motivated.
Having very recently recorded an episode about the Black Redcoats, the Corps of Colonial Marines from the War of 1812, and that will actually be a two-parter that's incoming with Matthew Taylor over the course of the Christmas period. It's really interesting to hear the contrast between what happens in the War of 1812 and what the norm is from the British as sort of the maintainers of the status quo of this kind of hierarchical, pyramidic, fundamentally exploitative society that is the institution of slavery in the colonies. And I think it really serves to highlight the degree to which what happens around the Chesapeake during the War of 1812 is a monumental outlier that is sort of nobody really sort of sees coming in terms of that attitude. Josh, you've been sitting there very patiently whilst I have dominated this microphone and sort of held it out of arm's reach from you. I will now be quiet for a change on this show and let you actually make some headway.
Thank you, Zach. Although I do appreciate the direction you steered that interview in, because it's important, I think, to paint the picture of the Caribbean like instability, and then even more so once you add things like the French Revolution and the ideas of equality and individual rights. Once you throw them into the picture, you very much get the impression that the Caribbean is about to explode. And indeed it is, because you gave us a few names there, Victor Hugo and Julien Fedon, and I'd like to take the interview in that direction, because while everything was seemingly going to plan for the British, as you said, in the first year or so of their expeditioning, um, things begin to change in a few of those Antillean islands in 1795, because those chaps I just mentioned, they lead large-scale insurrections, namely in St. Vincent and Grenada, which complicate an already enormously complicated situation for the British. So, what caused these revolts to happen in 1795? Is it as simple as opportunism? And how do the British respond? And what does this mean for the bigger picture in the Caribbean?
So, I mean, 1795 is the year that matters because so the British eventually are driven out of Guadeloupe by the end of 1794, and Victor Hugo is able to consolidate this recaptured French colony. He's able to consolidate his power there. He brings a guillotine over and a whole series of French colonists who collaborated with the British get executed. Many of them get guillotined. So he establishes kind of the Caribbean version of the terror, if you want. And he then uses Guadeloupe as a base for French for a more, it's the first time the French now go on the front foot. They go on. They become aggressive in the region. The British are driven out of Saint Lucie, so they're having Saint Lucia is they lose, and then Guadeloupe becomes a base for particularly naval operations in the region. So French privateers, corsairs, begin to operate out of Guadeloupe, attacking British shipping, attacking also neutral American shipping, trading with the British. And many of these corsairs are formerly enslaved people, often in relatively small vessels. There are a lot of canoes, sloops. So this becomes a kind of corsair infested part of the sea, attacking kind of British commercial commerce and trade in the region, as well as the kind of supplies. And at the same time, he also goes on the offensive, reaching out to already disaffected and already potentially, resistant groups elsewhere in the British Caribbean. So Fedon, say, is essentially a free man of color of French descent, who leads an insurrection. Initially, it has its origins amongst that free non-white population, but then expands to parts of the enslaved population. The British are driven back to only the colonial capital, is the only bit of Grenada they control. And Grenada is interesting because Grenada essentially goes from a place where, as I said before, it's pretty much second to only Jamaica as a kind of vibrant, profitable plantation economy, of course, destructive of environments and human life with that. Grenada will never recover, even when the British eventually manage to beat the insurgents back. Grenada never really recovers. The plantation system doesn't ever get back to its previous state. Situation in St. Vincent in the same year, and is again, Hugues reaches out to specific groups in St. Vincent to try and encourage them to rebel against the British. And there, it's a different social group who are really important, which is it's a population the British call the Black Caribs. And essentially, this is a population that are of mixed indigenous African descent, the Kalinago African descent, who'd fought wars against the British previously, and had sought at some points alliance with the French against the British. So in some way, this is just a renewal of that. And that particular group are focused on essentially resisting the expansion of the plantation system in St. Vincent. And again, for some French regulars, French supplies are provided. And when we say French regulars, by this point, what we mainly mean are soldiers of African descent who are traveling from Guadeloupe and from other places to fight alongside who the British call the Black Caribs. And again, the British find themselves pushed back pretty much to only controlling the colonial capital of St. Vincent. So suddenly the British have gone from a kind of expansive phase where they seem to have achieved everything they wanted to very quickly, to a situation where they're being not only losing their gains they'd made, but also having their own colonies threatened. And things aren't going very well in Saint-Domingue either. Plus, there's an insurrection of something called the Maroons, who essentially are enslaved people who'd escaped from slavery in Jamaica. This is all happening in 1795, and this is a moment of kind of real crisis for the British. Everything seems to be unraveling very rapidly. So the way they respond is with an even larger surge of soldiers. So this is the Abercrombie Christian expedition, and they send even more soldiers and sailors into the region. And Ralph Abercrombie, Scottish military officer, essentially is given the job of end all the unrest in all our islands, and then recapture everything back from the French again. And they're able to recapture St. Lucie, leaving John Moore in charge, and they're able to put down the insurrections in St. Vincent and Grenada. But that takes them so long, and it's so costly in terms of lives, that Abercrombie comes to the decision that he doesn't have the men, and he's particularly concerned about the artillery to attack Guadeloupe. So the French remain, Victor Hugues remains in this kind of base in Guadeloupe, constantly threatening to break back out and threaten the British in Dominica, for example, and continuing to operate, use Guadeloupe as a privateering base to try and undermine the British power in the region. So that's the way the British achieve it, essentially by pouring even more soldiers into the region, and at great cost in terms of lives and treasure, if you want to put it that way.
You spoke earlier about the role of national metropolitan events, especially in France, in conditioning the social chaos we get in the Caribbean in the 1790s. So I'd like to just pause for a moment and think about like these slave revolts erupting across the Caribbean. Why did the Caribbean just spontaneously combust? Because obviously on the one hand we have you spoke about like the role of ideas and ideology coming from the revolution especially. But also do we not have to be careful not to diminish kind of the agency of the Caribbean itself, and presumably the fact that they were they were behaving like opportunistically as you would in those conditions if you were an enslaved person. So I guess what's the kind of balance between across the Caribbean in drawing from ideas from the metropole in your behavior versus kind of acting ultimately as a Caribbean actor, like against those above you, like as an enslaved person. So it's a long-winded way of asking. So why did the Caribbean spontaneously combust? And can you kind of clarify that balance for us?
I mean, I think the point I'd make, Josh, is that I would reject the notion of spontaneous combustion, because I think that it precisely implies that that's the powder keg metaphor, that it's just thing that explodes. I mean, if you think about the events, what happens in St. Vincent, what happens in Grenada, the extended resistance that takes place against the British when they capture Saint Lucie, Saint Lucia for the second time, as well as the Maroon War that breaks out in Jamaica in 1795. These aren't spontaneous things. They're not like a natural disaster or something. These come about because of the long-term aims and interests of some of the groups involved. The Jean de Couleur, like Julien Fredon in Grenada, had been protesting, had been trying to protect their customary rights, resist social and political and legal discrimination that they face at the hands of the British, had been doing so through kind of political means, and weren't getting anywhere, and were finding themselves more and more marginalized, more and more mistreated by the kind of British authorities, if you want. The Maroons in Jamaica, when they rise up, likewise they'd fought wars against the British earlier in the 18th century, and by the mid 1790s, they felt that some of the kind of treaties and terms that they'd come to that made peace with the British were being undermined by the British, and they responded to this. And the opportunity associated with the extended regional conflict was too good a one to miss. And that idea that when you often see major insurrections, which might involve enslaved people working in collaboration with other social groups, like the Kalinago in St. Vincent or the Free People of Color in Grenada, they often precisely take place at moments of war when there aren't as many, in this case, British soldiers around, where there's seen as an opportunity to take advantage of the fact that the authorities are distracted with other things, that their enemies are weak because they're at war. In the case of Jamaica, so many British soldiers had been sent to Saint Domingue, so there weren't as many British soldiers in Jamaica. They were much more reliant on the militia. That's a very opportune time for an insurrection if you're the one of the maroon groups that rise up. So, and these things come about through planning. I mean, Uga's writing to people, pamphlets are being circulated. The leader of the so-called Black Caribs, the Kalinago in St. Vincent, Joseph Chotweye, reaches out to the French, making sure, if we rise up, will you support us? So there's a lot of kind of planning and background, in the background going on. These aren't just like spontaneous reactions. They all come about because of coordination, the provision of supply of arms, these, as I say. So that's why I'd put a great deal of emphasis on the agency of these various groups to lead these insurrections. I would never see them as spontaneous combustion, as if it's some kind of natural event. So absolutely, the agency of these people. One of the problems, of course, we have is many of our sources give us it from the other side. I mean, in some ways, coming back to what we were discussing with Zach before, that idea of calling these various insurgent groups banditti or brigands almost just reduces it to it's just like a form of it's just crime. It's just, rather than something that's actually much more fundamental, that's actually motivated, motivated by a desire to remain free. That's a pretty powerful idea to motivate people. And that's not an abstract idea. That's not just sort of someone hearing what's going on in Paris or misinterpreting what the French Republic represents. That idea that freedom had been formally acknowledged by the French, and then the British have turned up and gone, no. Actually, slavery is going to remain, and we're going to defend it. You can see that lived experience of freedom. You can see why people were highly motivated to continue to fight for their liberty and collective freedoms.
Can I stay with the theme of sort of responses to enslaved people endeavoring to secure their own liberty, in terms of sort of the British response and trying to crush these revolts? What's the nature of the response to the slave revolts? And that, I know that sounds like a very sort of naive question. You would automatically assume, well, brutality will be at the core of that, large scale executions and all the rest of it. But it does inevitably run into a challenge of the question of property, because the plantation owners, the people who fundamentally own these human beings, would turn around and sort of object to the fact that they will lose their inverted commas investment in that human being, who may well have risen up against the status quo, but fundamentally they don't want to lose that money, which therefore creates a challenge that needs to be navigated by the British Armed Forces when they're trying to restore control. So how do they do that? And to what extent is this a problem that gets dealt with at a civil level through civilian methods of retribution, but also civilian legal processes, rather than the military getting involved and deciding who is going to be shot and all the rest of it?
I mean, in some ways, that distinction, it kind of blurs. I mean, like when John Moore is made governor of Saint Lucie, Saint Lucia, he's a military governor. I mean, all the authority derives from him, and he does try various ways of pacifying the situation. He's trying to encourage French planters who fled to come back to re-establish control over their estates, to get the plantation economy up and going. He's traveling around making decrees, making proclamations saying if people will return to their estates, if they'll come back in from the woods and they will continue their work, then that's fine. With amnesties, we'll just move on. It's fine. So he's trying to sort of do that. But at the same time, when that's unsuccessful, he's also trying to find ways of negotiating. He's looking for intermediaries who he can kind of work with, who he thinks can go out and speak to and explain that what he wants to do is to restore prosperity and peace. He's not interested in mass killings. And some of those intermediate groups it turns out, are actually like playing against him, and trying to look for sort of delay things and trying to encourage French supplies and so forth. So you're absolutely right, and that, of course, one of the consequences of that is in the aftermath when many of these islands are, when peace in inverted commas eventually comes to Grenada, or rather when the only violence that's been enacted in Grenada is the violence of slavery rather than the violence of an insurgency and a counterinsurgency. Many of the former owners, the planters, they look for compensation. They're constantly, the British government is saying, well, we've lost this. If we want to get, we need ways of re-establishing the plantation system. A lot of planters move into debt in this period as part. Estates are consolidated, so their owners would have multiple estates on a colony, and they'll move all what's left of their enslaved population to a single one to try and get things up and running there, in order to sort of then produce the profits that will allow them to re-establish planting elsewhere. So you see in the aftermath of these insurrections, you see that kind of effort. So yeah, I mean, but even at the most extreme, if you think about the sort of the place where you're essentially talking about a kind of genocidal logic, Zach, and about how much that it comes to the fore. If you look at the most extreme example of a counterinsurgency in the Caribbean, it's the Leclerc expedition. It's when Napoleon sends his brother-in-law over to restore full French control of Saint-Domingue. And at a certain point, Leclerc writes to Napoleon and says, look, we basically have to pretty much kill everybody over the age of about 12 and start again with our enslaved population, because these people are never, ever going to accept. They're never just going to retire, go back to estates and start working again. And there's definitely a kind of sadly, a really genocidal logic here that once people are, these people are demonstrated for they have obviously a desire for freedom, and they've also demonstrated the capacity to protect that freedom. But you're right, that balance between preserving the plantation system, if you call it that broadly, and what that means, which is both having a docile or at least a cowed workforce that's going to be kept in place through more routine violence of slavery, versus the kind of spectacular forms of violence associated with these periods of insurgency. That's one of the reasons why the plantation system doesn't recover in some of these places, frankly. And it's one of the reasons why there's such an interest in, say, expansion into new colonies, newly acquired British colonies like Trinidad becomes this almost like it becomes a new frontier, and it's the colony they keep after taking it from Spain, and that will rapidly grow and develop because in some ways they're starting from fresh. Whereas, as I say, St. Vincent, Grenada, they never really recover to the way they were before the outbreak of the Revolutionary Wars, frankly. And Saint-Domingue doesn't either, for that matter.
So we've kind of painted a picture, I guess, of the geopolitical or the strategic situation throughout the 1790s. How does that situation, I don't want to say resolve itself, but how does it sort of die down, especially towards the Peace of Amiens? And what are the terms of the Peace of Amiens for kind of with regards to the Caribbean? So does Britain gain much, or is there really less to speak of in that sense?
So things start to calm down, in inverted commas, in the Caribbean from probably about 1797, something like that. The British go on and are able to go back on a more aggressive stance, aggressive posture. They are successful in the sense that they capture a series of Dutch colonies, because the Dutch have, the Dutch Republic is now supporting the French, are captured. The places that will eventually become British Guiana, now Guyana. And Trinidad is taken from Spain, and the British are able to defend themselves. There are a few attacks. The Spanish attack what's now Belize, British Honduras, as was, and the British are able to drive that off. But the British are unsuccessful in other ways. They attempt to attack Puerto Rico, and that's a disaster. They're repulsed at Puerto Rico. But basically, under terms, when peace, the peace has two main effects. One is basically they return everything. All the Dutch colonies get returned. All the French colonies get returned. The only exception is Trinidad. Trinidad is kept and becomes a crown colony, and you see a kind of, say, an inpouring of investment. And the guy who's left in charge of who's put in charge of Trinidad is Thomas Picton, as in, he of the Battle of Waterloo. And what he does in Trinidad, there is an attempt to try him in England or in the UK, in Britain, for essentially brutalities in Trinidad. And essentially he's using effectively the British Army to expand the plantation system. And that's a story in itself. So Trinidad's the only place that's kept, and everything else is returned to normal, to the previous status quo. But the other thing that the treaty, the moment of peace does, of course, it allows the French to do something, which is this is when Napoleon sends a Leclerc expedition. So they use that opportunity of peace in the region to try and establish control back over Saint-Domingue, where by that point Toussaint Louverture is operating with a great deal of autonomy. So that's two things that change. When war breaks out again, basically the British quite quickly stops occupying many of these territories. I think Guadeloupe, is the last to fall in. I think it's 1810, and from that point the Caribbean is pretty pacified. And then all those territories, or Martinique and Guadeloupe, are returned back to the French. But this time the British also hold on to many of those Dutch colonies in the south that will eventually become so Essequibo, Berbice, Demerara. They will eventually become Guyana, and that will be like Trinidad, another place where a lot of investment is poured in, and there's an expansion of the plantation system in that direction. The last thing to say, and essentially this is slightly outside the British ambit, but it's important to make this point, is that the eventual independence of Haiti and the terrible damage and loss of life that had been wrought by, more than a decade of almost a decade and a half of fighting in Saint-Domingue. One of the consequences of that is there's still a demand in the world market for coffee and sugar. And the place where the investment moves into, and the place that expands, is Cuba. And that's why Cuba becomes such an important colony in the 19th century.
Thinking now, kind of in the centuries that have passed since the winding down of war, as it were, there's been a trope among historians of the Napoleonic Wars, thankfully less and less so, I think, in recent decades, that the Caribbean was kind of a monumental bloodbath, a waste of time, in comparison to the rest of the Napoleonic Wars, which was obviously very important and not a waste of time. So I'm interested to hear how far was this Caribbean theatre strategically a waste of time for the British? Can you reflect upon that viewpoint for us?
It's funny. I should tell you that one of the reasons why I became interested in Caribbean history as a undergraduate was because when I was as a child, I was very, very interested in the history of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. I used to read Napoleon's military maxims, and I have some of the books behind me I've still got as a kid. I was really, really into this historical period. Then I got to university and was given a book to read about the Haitian Revolution. And this is pre-2004, the bicentenary of the Haitian Revolution, which saw a kind of real uptick in interest in that history of that country. And I read this history of the Haitian Revolution and I went, why have I never heard about this? Even though it's involving exactly the same people at exactly the same period of time that I've read all this stuff about. And that's why I then said, right, I really need to understand the history of the Caribbean. So that became the trigger. So you're absolutely right. There was a tradition that this is kind of all pointless and a waste. I mean, in some ways it is. It's war. Is there anything more noble about dying on the fields of Spain versus, the plantations of St. Lucia, in the late 18th, early 19th century, So in some ways, it's all kind of pointless and destructive. But I think it's fair to say, in some ways, the British were successful. The British intervention in Saint-Domingue is one of the causes, not the only, but it's one of the things that eventually leads to the creation of an independent Haiti, thus denying the French their most valuable colony in the Caribbean and thwarting Napoleonic ambitions for a revived French empire in the Americas. So I guess they were successful in that regard. That worked. The British are successful in defending their colonies. Okay, they do face insurrections, but they don't lose any of their colonies. They lose them for short periods, but they're able to overwhelm these insurrections. So I guess the men who were serving under Abercrombie, who were serving under Grey, they achieved the thing that they were sent out to do. They do so at terrible loss of life, but also, and I think we mustn't over. It's really important not to overlook this. The British are able to acquire a series of new colonies in the Southern Caribbean, and that is something that leads a whole kind of buoyancy to the British colonial economy. And that those southern parts of the Caribbean remain so buoyant that even after Britain has formally ended its involvement in the trade in enslaved people, and then in the 1830s will formally end its involvement in slavery, there's still labour demand in those parts of the southern Caribbean. And one of the ways the British seek to resolve that problem for the plantation system is by bringing indentured workers. So actually, in some ways, the British are successful there too, in that regard. So yes, it's incredibly costly. There isn't a particular, there aren't many particular heroic engagements that we celebrate. As there aren't. But I think at great cost to life and treasure, the British do achieve a lot of what they set out to achieve in the first place. I think whether it's worth it, well, again, there's a question about the nature of war in general, I suppose.
There you go, folks. We've got deep philosophical questions on many facets of this period to offer you on this podcast. David, wow. Thank you so much for such a wide-ranging interview. Kudos to you, Josh. I think you managed to squeeze in 5 of the original planned questions, whilst I went off on a myriad of different avenues. David Lambert, Professor of Caribbean History at the University of Warwick, thank you so much for your time. Folks, go and buy Soldiers of Uncertain Rank, the West India Regiments in British Imperial Culture. It's available from Cambridge University Press. It is newly minted, newly printed, hot off the press, insert whatever kind of metaphor you want here. I can't wait to get my teeth into it. David, I hate to break this to you, but we want you back for not just one episode, quite frankly. I think Josh and I have been sort of quietly planning a mini series off the back of this. So I very much hope you'll come back and join us for more. But thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating.
Thank you. It's been great to chat to you both. Thanks so much.
Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. Merry Christmas, folks. If you'd like to spread the festive cheer this evening, you know what I'm about to say. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Normally, when you listen to these, please, you're likely to be on the commute, so can't act on them, especially if you're in the car. And then you perhaps promptly forget. But if you're tuning in over the break, there is a chance you could actually do it right now. It'll take you a few seconds. And if all of our listeners did it, we'd be one of the top-rated podcasts in Europe. If you've enjoyed the 80 episodes we've produced this year and the hundreds of hours of free entertainment we provide to you, this is your way of paying us back. Help us rebuild. Help us reach more people. Head to Apple Podcasts, leave a quick sentence and a 5-star score. I can't emphasize enough how much difference it makes to the algorithm. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people memberships to the Patreon perks we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, socials, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join this buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying such a richer offering. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some exciting documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-December 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Cotland, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, and Dan Friedman. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Woolcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.